Asserting central dominion immediately, this pawn stake aims to command open lines and influence future piece placement. Establishing central presence, d5 immediately challenges white's pawn, creating a pawn structure that defines the early strategic battleground. Instantly challenging the center, this thrust aims to exploit any hesitation in black's development and seize control of key squares. Securing the central pawn, this move prepares to develop the bishop, though it slightly restricts the queen's diagonal. Developing the knight to its natural square, preparing to contest the center and control key diagonals. Developing the knight here elegantly prepares for queenside expansion, while reinforcing the central pawn structure against potential immediate pressure. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, immediately contesting black's central pawn and restricting piece mobility, a common theme in this opening. Solidifying the center, black prepares to castle and develop the queenside, a crucial step in this queen's gambit declined structure. Establishing a solid pawn structure, white prepares to castle kingside, reinforcing the central pawn chain and developing the kingside knight for further central control. Securing the king's safety with castling allows for immediate piece redistribution and prepares for central pawn breaks. Developing this knight strategically solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares for future queenside expansion, while also aiming to disrupt black's harmonious piece deployment, particularly the bishop on g5. Developing the knight to d7 supports a potential central pawn break with c5 or e5 later, while also preparing to reroute the knight if necessary, perhaps to b6 to pressure white's queenside. Unclenching the central pawn tension opens the way for potential piece activity, but also signals a readiness for exchanges that might simplify the position and potentially favor the side with slightly better development or piece placement. White chooses to clarify the pawn structure, inviting a response that will dictate the ensuing positional battle. Reclaiming central space, this way initiates an immediate pawn chain imbalance, potentially opening lines for your bishop on f8 later in the game, while also clearing the path for a potential queen sortie towards the queenside should the opportunity arise. Developing the bishop to d3 eyes the kingside and supports a potential kingside advance later, subtly pressuring black's central pawn structure and preparing to castle kingside, aiming for a solid, harmonious development before committing further pieces. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for central expansion, black anchors the d5 pawn. The queen now eyes the kingside and prepares to join the assault, reinforcing the idea of a potential queenside expansion or an attack down the c-file after castling. Bringing the rook to the center often signals a desire to contest the open e-file or reposition for a kingside attack. Here it subtly prepares potential pawn pushes like f5 or b6, while keeping the king relatively secure behind its pawns. Securing the monarch on the queenside unlocks the c-file for immediate pressure, creating a dynamic imbalance as black's king remains rooted in the center, a target ripe for future exploitation through pawn storms or piece incursions. Rerouting the knight to f8 is a thoughtful maneuver, intending to reposition it to g6 or h7, thereby reinforcing the kingside and preparing for potential queenside expansion or central counterplay. This subtle repositioning aims to enhance piece coordination without immediately creating overt threats. Creating a bit of breathing room for your bishop on g5, and potentially setting up a later g4 push to challenge black's kingside space. Black solidifies their central presence, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially launch a kingside initiative. Unleashing an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, white immediately seeks to shatter black's defenses, creating immediate imbalances and forcing a strategic recalculation of how to manage the ensuing chaos. A strategic repositioning begins as the knight journeys from its besieged outpost, seeking a more active role and potentially reinforcing the kingside. Purging the knight of that prominent diagonal clears the way for the queen's assault on the kingside, but concedes a crucial tempo in the battle for central control. Reclaiming central influence, black reestablishes a vital piece on its most active diagonal, preparing for future pawn advances and reinforcing its core structure. Securing the monarch on a flank often signals preparation for aggressive pawn thrusts elsewhere, or a prudent retreat from the central crossfire. Reclaiming the central tension, black repositions the rook, aiming to activate this piece along the open c-file, which now presents an inviting highway towards white's vulnerable queenside. Hoping to disrupt black's solid setup, white endeavors to awaken the slumbering kingside pawns and potentially generate attacking opportunities, though this commitment of the rook might prematurely expose it should black find a way to exploit the open files. Black boldly challenges white's queenside pawn structure, aiming to disrupt the centralized control and open avenues for piece activity, fundamentally shifting the initiative's focus towards the flanks. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white proactively grabs more territory and aims to pry open lines for his pieces. This aggressive pawn push signals an intent to directly challenge black's king's safety, potentially leading to a sharp, tactical battle. White is gambling on creating an immediate threat, forcing black to react defensively and perhaps disrupting his coordinated development. The long-term consequence could be weakened pawn structures for white, but the immediate goal is to create discomfort and initiative. Propelling the queenside pawn forward aggressively seizes space and challenges white's central control, potentially unraveling the pawn structure or forcing a concession on the queenside. The knight's leap to a4 initiates a daring flank maneuver, aiming to disrupt black's queenside expansion and potentially exploit the open files that may soon materialize. This aggressive positioning forces black to consider immediate counterplay, lest their pawn storm on the b-file become unstoppable. The pawn thrust to c5 dramatically escalates the central conflict, aiming to shatter white's pawn chain and create open lines for black's pieces. This aggressive push challenges the stability of white's queenside immediately, forcing a reassessment of defensive structures and potentially opening the c-file for black's rook. It's a bold assertion of counterplay, seeking to exploit any potential weaknesses that might arise from white's kingside castling and the advanced pawns. A bold gambit, sacrificing a pawn to disrupt black's development and seize initiative on the queenside. White sacrifices material for an active position, aiming to pry open lines and exploit the exposed enemy king before black can consolidate. Confronting the knight's invasion, this counterstrike unravels white's advanced pawns and opens critical lines for immediate counterplay. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the d-file for your queen, simultaneously creating a structural imbalance with black's isolated d-pawn and initiating a fight for central control that promises dynamic possibilities. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, black forces a dramatic realignment of white's forces and opens critical lines for an assault. This aggressive thrust sacrifices material temporarily to gain a dynamic advantage, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and exploit the weakened queenside structure. Sacrificing the pawn on a3 to eliminate black's encroaching b-pawn, this decision opens the a-file for white's rook and simultaneously resolves the awkward pawn structure on the queenside, aiming to simplify the position and potentially activate the rook on the newly freed file. A bold gambit appears as black sacrifices material to rip open the queenside and inject chaos, aiming to disrupt white's castled king and exploit the newly created weaknesses. Reclaiming the queen from the edge of the action, white seeks to re-establish central control and prepare for an offensive. The awkwardness of the doubled pawns on the queenside for black, a consequence of the recent pawn capture, is now white's primary target to exploit. The d-file, though open, is currently less threatening than the pressure white can build towards black's king if the pieces can be brought into more coordinated attacking positions. This is a subtle repositioning aimed at consolidating advantage and probing for weaknesses, rather than a direct tactical blow. Unleashing the queenside pawn storm, a5 boldly challenges white's initiative and attempts to disrupt the carefully constructed pawn chain, aiming to gain valuable space for black's pieces and potentially open lines for future attacks. Shifting the knight to d4 injects a significant amount of pressure, aiming to exploit the exposed king and create new attacking avenues, while simultaneously reinforcing the center and preparing potential pawn pushes. Focusing on the central pawn chain, This knight repositions to a square that reinforces the d-pawn while eyeing potential targets further down the file. A subtle but crucial shift in the battle for positional advantage after the recent exchanges. Unleashing a pawn storm towards the enemy king, White aggressively seeks to dismantle Black's pawn shield and open lines for attack, creating immediate spatial pressure that demands a precise defensive response from Black. Unleashing the knight to e5 injects a potent dose of activity, directly challenging White's pawn chain and aiming to disrupt the queenside structure. This aggressive redeployment immediately pressures the c4 square, forcing White to consider defending it and potentially sacrificing material if not handled carefully. A decisive central confrontation is initiated, aiming to shatter Black's pawn structure and expose their king. Black's counterplay bursts forth by aiming to pry open the queenside and create crucial weaknesses in White's pawn structure. Opening the c-file to exploit the exposed Black king seems paramount after Black's aggressive pawn thrust. Tactical skirmish has finally settled, and Black's queen, after a series of captures, reclaims her central dominance by taking the pawn on c5. This pivotal recapture not only removes White's passed pawn, but also repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing potential weaknesses in White's pawn structure and ready to support any future advances. The board is now cleared of many exchanges, hinting at a more dynamic middle game where piece coordination and pawn breaks will become paramount. Pushing this pawn opens a dangerous diagonal for the queen, aiming to exploit the exposed Black king and create attacking opportunities down the queenside. Recognizing the exposed nature of the queenside pawns, Black aims to solidify their defense while keeping options open for counterplay. The pawn push on the queenside aims to create a protected passed pawn, but it ignores the looming threat on the kingside where Black's pieces are starting to swarm. White gambles on creating a distraction, hoping the pawn's advance will preoccupy Black, allowing White to consolidate their defenses or perhaps launch a counterattack. However, this maneuver might be too slow, as the immediate danger to White's king from the centralized Black queen and knight remains unaddressed. It's a fascinating strategic gamble that could either secure an advantage or lead to swift positional ruin depending on Black's response and White's subsequent tactical execution. A daring attempt to disrupt White's centralized power, trading off a piece for initiative and hoping to exploit the open lines that emerge. Unleashing the queen to a central, active square, White reclaims the initiative and eyes Black's somewhat exposed king, while simultaneously defending against any immediate tactical skirmishes on the queenside. The bishop on d7 now anchors the queenside pawn majority, aiming to support advances like c4 while keeping an eye on the e6 square, potentially creating a solid defensive shield and preparing for future pawn pushes. Refocusing the rook's influence onto the c-file after the queen trade intensifies pressure, seeking to disrupt Black's pawn majority before it becomes an unstoppable force. Challenging the imposing pawn wall with the rook's relocation to the open b-file seeks to disrupt White's tightly packed structure and create counterplay on the queenside. Opening the queen's diagonal to challenge Black's dominant rook on the c-file and to potentially initiate a queenside pawn push with the b-pawn is White's immediate priority after the exchange. Seizing the open file and the now exposed b-pawn, Black injects immediate dynamism, aiming to unravel White's slightly overextended pawn structure and create threats on the queenside. Seizing the opportunity presented by Black's exposed pieces, this knight jump actively disrupts the coordination of Black's queenside pawns and threatens immediate tactical gains, forcing a reassessment of Black's defensive structure. Black regains crucial material equality, setting the stage for a sharp positional struggle by re-establishing a symmetrical pawn structure and preparing to activate the queen on the open diagonal. Unleashing a forcing sequence, White sacrifices a rook to shatter Black's pawn shield and force the enemy king into the open, initiating a potentially decisive mating attack through diagonal penetration. Suddenly, the queen's retreat, sacrificing tempo, opens a desperate rearguard action against the looming checkmate. Exchanging queens now simplifies to a favorable rook and pawn endgame for White, aiming to leverage the passed pawn on the queenside. A fundamental endgame transition begins now, shifting focus to pawn structure and piece activity. Black's decision to recapture the rook with the king on e8 signifies a willingness to enter a potentially simplified, yet still strategically rich phase of the game. The immediate consequence is the elimination of immediate threats, but it also centralizes the black king, a common goal in endgames, though it might become a target later if white can generate any passed pawns or open files. The board is reduced, and each pawn and square gains immense importance as the game marches toward its conclusion. Activating the rook to the center and eyeing the weakened e-pawn creates immediate pressure. The rook relocates to the edge, aiming to support the pawn's advance and potentially create a passed pawn if the exchange on the queen side materializes later, subtly challenging white's control over the open files. Opening the king's diagonal for potential pawn advancement or piece redeployment. This maneuver seeks to exploit the open nature of the board after the recent exchanges and activate a previously passive rook. Challenging the central pawn structure with a pawn push aims to disrupt white's unified front and potentially open lines for the rook, but it significantly weakens the kingside pawn shield, creating exploitable weaknesses around your monarch. Opening the g-file now fundamentally alters the character of the position, potentially creating a weakness around black's king for the coming middle game fireworks. The creation of that pawn chain offers a structural foothold, but it also solidifies weaknesses on the light squares surrounding your king. Pouncing on the pinned knight opens a path to consolidate material advantage. Securing the monarch's escape route allows for a more proactive deployment of black's remaining forces. Bolstering the king's sanctuary, this repositioning aims to secure the monarch from any lingering tactical skirmishes on the queen side and prepares for a more centralized defensive posture as the game transitions into its endgame phase. Activating the rook on the 5th rank initiates a dynamic struggle for pawn territory, potentially disrupting white's unified structure and opening up avenues for piece penetration. Sensing an opportunity to improve piece activity and secure a more favorable endgame configuration, your rook relocates to the f-file, aiming to put immediate pressure on black's potentially exposed king and establish a more active presence on the board. The rook's relocation offers a new dimension of defense, shifting its attention from the queenside pawn structure to the critical central squares, while simultaneously preparing to support a potential king's side advance or even a pawn push on the f-file. Bolstering the pawn chain and opening a diagonal for the rook are the immediate gains, aiming to improve central control and exploit the compromised black king's position. The rook's retreat to the 8th rank initiates a fascinating endgame transition, aiming to fortify the kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn pushes down the d-file. The pawn chain's advance aims to cramp black's maneuvering room and create new outposts for white's pieces, potentially setting up a decisive breakthrough in the center or on the queen side.